Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're diving into something I think we can all relate to, stress and resilience. And we've got two really interesting sources we're going to be looking at today. One is from mind.org.uk, which is sort of a practical guide to understanding stress and building resilience. And then the other is a scientific journal article that really gets into the nuts and bolts, the neurobiology of what's going on in our brains and bodies when we experience stress.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting combination of sources because, we all experience stress,
Right.
but understanding kind of the mechanisms behind it and then also how we can actually bolster our resilience is so important for both mental and physical health.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, mine kind of starts with the basics.
Yeah.
What is stress? And it's not just, that feeling of having too much on your plate. It's actually a physiological response
Right.
that impacts our whole system.
Yeah, it is. It's really interesting to think about how our bodies are essentially primed to deal with stress. It's like a survival mechanism. Right. So think about our ancestors thousands of years ago. They needed that stress response to run away from predators or to, face some kind of a threat.
Right. Fight or flight.
Exactly. So we still have that same system, but now the threats that we face are often, different kinds of things, like
Mhm.
work deadlines or social pressures or, things like that.
Right.
But that same system is getting activated. And so the key is to understand, these hormones like cortisol and adrenaline,
Right.
they're helpful in short bursts, but when they're constantly activated, it can be really detrimental to our health.
Yeah. And I think that's a perfect segue into talking about resilience. Because mine points out that,
Right.
resilience, which is essentially our ability to cope with stress. It isn't a level playing field for everybody.
Right.
Things like poverty
Hmm.
or discrimination, lack of support, those kinds of things can actually make it much harder to be resilient.
Yeah, and that's where the scientific journal article comes in, It kind of sheds light on why that is. It talks about how resilience is really linked to our ability to regulate those stress hormones,
Right.
so keeping them in check. But if you're already facing, extra challenges, it's
Yeah.
like starting a race a few steps behind.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of these practical tips that Mind offers,
Okay.
especially for, our listeners who are really interested in kind of applying this knowledge to their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
So they start with,
Hmm.
be kind to yourself,
Right.
which sounds so simple, but I think it's something we often forget,
Yeah.
especially when we're stressed out.
Yeah. It is a simple concept. But, when you're in the midst of stress,
Yeah.
it's easy to forget.
Right.
Right. And so, mine talks about self-care isn't selfish, it's actually essential.
Right.
And they give an example of, you know, taking breaks for enjoyable activities. You can almost think of it as hitting the reset button on your system.
I love that analogy,
Yeah.
the reset button.
Just give yourself a moment to kind of step away from the stress
Absolutely.
and recharge. And, another thing they highlight is the importance of having a strong support network.
Yes. And this is where things get really interesting because you made this fascinating connection between this point and the science.
Yes. So the journal article actually details how social support can buffer against stress on a biological level.
Wow.
It even cites studies where people with strong support actually showed lower cortisol levels during stressful tasks.
That's incredible.
Right. So, it's not just about feeling better.
Right.
It's about, literally changing our physiology.
Wow. So building those bonds is not just like feel-good advice. It's a science-backed resilience strategy.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like having, a team of people who are there to help you navigate those challenges.
Awesome.
And then, Mind also talks about identifying your triggers.
Okay.
So those things that consistently set off your stress response.
So it's like knowing your enemy so you can plan for it.
Right. Exactly. So instead of being caught off guard, you can anticipate
Right.
and even practice coping mechanisms in advance. It's almost like having a secret weapon ready to deploy when the stress hits.
I love that.
Huh.
Okay. So for our busy listeners out there,
Yes.
Mind also offers some great time management tips. So things like prioritizing, setting smaller goals, not trying to conquer the world all in one day.
Right.
They even have this great analogy, which I love. They say that the brain is like an engine. And if you run it too hot all day, every day without checking the oil and water, it breaks.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. It's like we need to give ourselves permission to rest and recharge.
Right.
Otherwise, we're just going to burn ourselves out.
And speaking of unexpected approaches, Mind suggests that getting involved in your community can actually help with stress.
Yeah. That one surprised me too at first.
Me too.
But it makes sense when you think about it because, addressing issues that you care about can actually foster a sense of control and purpose.
Right.
Right. And that can be a really powerful antidote to that feeling of helplessness that stress often brings.
Right. Because I think a lot of times when we're feeling stressed, it's like things are outside of our control.
Exactly.
But if we can actually be involved in our community and
Mm.
make a difference, then it gives us some of that control back.
Exactly. And it also helps us connect with other people.
Right. Which brings us back to the social support.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Full circle.
Yeah. So before we dive deeper into the fascinating science behind all of this,
Mm.
what has stood out to you so far from Mind's advice? Like anything that particularly resonates with your own experiences?
Yeah, I think for me, the be kind to yourself message really hits home.
Yeah.
We often get caught up in self-criticism and pushing ourselves to the limit. But I think remembering to pause, to celebrate small wins, and to just acknowledge our humanness, it's so important.
I completely agree with you. I know for me, I often struggle with the organization piece and just kind of feeling swamped by all the tasks that I have to do.
Yeah.
So Mind's focus on prioritizing and setting smaller, achievable goals really resonates with me, you know?
Yeah.
It's like breaking things down into smaller chunks feels much more manageable than trying to tackle everything at once.
Right. And that's the beauty of it. Even small shifts in how we approach stress can have a ripple effect on our well-being.
Absolutely. All right. Are you ready to explore the science behind all of this?
I am. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's do it. I'm particularly intrigued by how social support actually works on a neurobiological level. Like what's going on in our brains and bodies.
Yeah. We'll unpack those complex mechanisms
Okay.
and see how they translate into real-world implications for our health.
Awesome. I can't wait. Okay, so let's get into like the nitty-gritty. How does stress actually work in our bodies? We've talked about, cortisol, adrenaline, but like what's the bigger picture here?
Okay, so imagine this. You're facing some sort of challenge. Could be a looming deadline, a difficult conversation, maybe even a physical threat,
Right.
and your body kicks into gear
Right.
with this whole cascade of changes that are orchestrated by what's called the sympathetic nervous system.
Okay.
And it's essentially your body's internal alarm system
Yeah.
going off, prepping you to either fight or flee.
So it's like our ancient wiring kicking in, even if the threat is just like a work deadline.
Exactly, exactly. So things like your heart rate speeds up, your breathing gets faster, your blood vessels constrict. This neurotransmitter called norepinephrine floods your system, and it's all about mobilizing energy.
Yeah.
Sharpening your focus so you can deal with the situation.
So in those moments, it's actually helpful, right?
Yeah.
It's like giving you that boost of energy to tackle whatever you're facing.
Right, exactly. It's helpful in the short term, but here's the catch. If that stress response stays switched on for too long, those same helpful mechanisms can actually start to become detrimental.
So like chronic stress is keeping that system running on high
Exactly.
without a break.
Exactly. It's like if you were driving a car with your foot constantly on the gas pedal,
Yeah.
eventually you're going to burn out the engine.
Right. That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And this is actually really relevant to things like PTSD,
Right.
because studies show that people with PTSD often have heightened norepinephrine activity, even when they're not in a stressful situation.
Oh, wow. So it's like their system is just always stuck in overdrive.
Right. Exactly. So they're constantly feeling on edge, and that can be really exhausting.
Yeah. No kidding. So what can we do to regulate this system and like prevent it from going haywire?
So this is where it gets really interesting. The article highlights a few key things. So first of all, alongside norepinephrine, our bodies also release other chemicals like neuropeptide Y and galanin,
Okay.
and these act as regulators.
Okay.
They help to keep the stress response in check, so it's almost like a braking system.
Okay. So it's not just about hitting the gas. It's about having a way to ease off the gas as well.
Exactly.
Right.
And studies actually show that people who demonstrate like really high resilience to stress, they tend to have higher levels of these regulating chemicals.
No, that's interesting. So it's like they have a more finely tuned braking system.
Exactly. Exactly. So they can recover from those stressful situations more quickly.
So resilience isn't just about like being tough. It's about having a balanced system that can both like ramp up when needed, but also calm down.
Exactly. Exactly. And then, along with the sympathetic nervous system, we have another key player in the stress response, which is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis.
Okay. I'm just going to call it the HPA axis.
Yeah. Let's stick with the HPA axis.
Yeah, it's a little bit easier to say.
It's a mouthful. So the HPA axis is responsible for releasing cortisol
Oh,
because
wow.
it's often called the stress hormone. It gets a bad rap, but it's actually quite helpful in the short term,
Right.
right? So cortisol helps to mobilize energy, increases alertness.
So it's another part of that, like, get ready for action response.
Exactly.
Right.
But just like with any powerful system, you need those checks and balances,
Right.
right? And so that's where things like DHEA and allopregnanolone come in.
Okay, more complicated names. Tell me more.
Yeah, right? So think of these as like cortisol's counterparts. They basically help to dampen down the HPA axis activity, so prevent us from getting stuck in that state of chronic stress.
Okay, so they essentially help to, like, turn off the stress response once the threat has passed.
Exactly, right? So again, it's all about balance.
Right.
Being able to activate when you need to, but also being able to switch it off when you don't. And I think you had a question about where social support fits into all of this.
Yeah, you're right. Like, it's all starting to kind of click into place now. So those studies we talked about before where people with strong social support showed lower cortisol levels during stressful tasks. Is that because those social connections are actually helping to regulate these complex systems?
You're on the right track. So yes, having those supportive people in our lives can actually influence how our bodies respond to stress. So they help us to regulate those internal, gas pedals and brakes, so to speak.
Wow. So it's not just about, like, feeling better emotionally. It's like actually having a tangible impact on our physiology.
Exactly. It's like having a co-pilot
Right.
to help you navigate through those turbulent times. And speaking of feeling better, there's another really fascinating piece of this puzzle, which is oxytocin.
Okay. Oxytocin, the cuddle hormone.
There you go.
I know it's involved in bonding and connection.
Right, exactly. So it's involved in bonding, social connection, but it also plays a really important role in stress regulation.
Okay.
So studies have shown that oxytocin can actually reduce anxiety and lower cortisol levels,
Oh, wow.
particularly when it's combined with social support.
So it's like they work together to create this buffer.
Exactly, exactly. So they team up to help us feel safer, calmer, more connected, even when things are tough. I think this might be a good place to pause for a second, just to let all of that sink in. What are your thoughts so far?
It's pretty mind-blowing. Like, I
Uh-huh.
think we all intuitively know that having good people around us makes us feel better. But to see, like, the actual science behind it, like how these connections actually impact our hormones, our nervous system, our entire stress response,
Right.
it's incredible.
Yeah, it really highlights that profound connection between our social lives and our physical and mental well-being. So are you ready to see how this plays out in the real world?
Absolutely.
Because the article goes on to discuss, the actual health implications of all of this.
So let's dive in and see how this understanding of stress and social support really translates into, like, real-life consequences for our health.
Okay, so we've explored, all these intricate systems in our bodies that get activated when we're stressed, and we've talked about how social support can actually help to regulate those systems. But how does this translate to like our overall health? Are we talking about more than just feeling lonely or isolated?
Yeah, it's definitely much more than just a feeling. This research really highlights the powerful link between social connection and both our physical and mental well-being.
Mm,
The article even cites this landmark study called the Alameda County Studies,
okay.
and it found that people who didn't have strong social ties were actually significantly more likely to die from things like heart disease, stroke, even cancer, compared to those with rich social connections.
Wow. So it's not just about like feeling better, it's about an actual impact on longevity.
Right, exactly. And the impact is so significant that some researchers consider social support to be on par with things like obesity, smoking, or lack of exercise.
When it comes to predicting, how long we'll live.
That's huge.
Yeah, it really underscores how vital these connections are for our health.
So it's not just about, like, warding off the negative. It's about actively promoting the positive through these connections.
Exactly. And the benefits go beyond just physical health. Research consistently shows a strong link between poor social support and mental health challenges,
Sure.
particularly depression.
So it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
Yeah,
Lack of support can increase your risk of mental health issues and then also make it harder to recover.
right, exactly. So it's like a vicious cycle,
Yeah.
And there are studies that have found that people with limited social support not only have a higher likelihood of developing depression, but they also tend to experience longer recovery times.
Oh, wow.
And then, when it comes to things like trauma,
Mm,
what soldiers might face in combat, the research shows that those who have really strong social networks are much less likely to develop PTSD.
that makes sense because I imagine having that support system probably helps people to kind of process those difficult experiences
Mhm.
and not feel so alone with their pain.
Right.